What if the most dangerous part of a criminal investigation isn't the crime itself, but the quiet room where a suspect is asked to talk? No flashing lights, no courtroom drama, just a table, a chair, and a trained interrogator who knows exactly which psychological buttons to press. Some of the most infamous true crime cases in history were decided not by DNA or fingerprints, but by words spoken behind closed doors. Tonight, we're diving deep into real interrogation rooms, moments where psychology, pressure, and human vulnerability collide, and breaking down how trained psychologists interpret what really happened. Because when someone finally says, "I did it," the truth isn't always as simple as it sounds. Interrogations are not conversations. They are controlled psychological environments designed to elicit information, confessions, or contradictions. Modern interrogation techniques, particularly in the United States, are heavily influenced by the raid technique developed in the mid-20th century. While legally permitted in many jurisdictions, psychologists have long warned that these methods can manipulate human psychology in ways that are both powerful and dangerous. To understand how this plays out in real life, we need to examine actual cases, ones that have been studied, debated, and dissected by experts. One of the most widely analyzed interrogation cases is that of Brendan Dassey, connected to the murder of Teresa Halbach. Brendan was just 16 years old, with documented learning difficulties and a low IQ. Psychologists who reviewed his interrogation noted a textbook example of coercive influence. Investigators repeatedly fed him details, corrected his answers when they didn't align with their theory, and framed confession as the only path to going home. From a psychological standpoint, this created what's known as compliance under authority pressure. Adolescents are especially vulnerable to this dynamic. Their brains are still developing, particularly in areas related to judgment and long-term consequences. When Brendan eventually confessed, psychologists argue he wasn't recalling a crime, he was trying to satisfy authority figures and escape an overwhelming situation. This case is now frequently cited in academic literature on false confessions. Contrast that with the interrogation of Chris Watts, who confessed to murdering his pregnant wife Shannon and their 2 daughters. Psychologists point out that this interrogation succeeded not because of intimidation, but because of rapport, building, and moral framing. Investigators initially treated Watts as a grieving husband, allowing him to talk freely and feel understood. This lowered his psychological defenses. When confronted with evidence later, the emotional weight became unbearable. Experts note subtle signs throughout the interview. Watts avoided emotional language when describing his children, used distancing phrases, and showed incongruent body language. When the confession finally came, it aligned with known evidence, which psychologists consider a key marker of reliability. This case is often used as an example of how empathy, not aggression, can lead to truthful admissions. Another deeply studied interrogation is that of Jodi Arias, convicted of murdering Travis Alexander. Arias's interrogation stands out because of her consistent narrative control. Psychologists analyzing her behavior note classic signs of narcissistic traits: calm emotional presentation, detailed storytelling, and a strong need to appear intelligent and composed. During questioning, she shifted between denial, victimhood, and selective memory loss. What fascinates experts is her ability to adapt her story in real time while maintaining emotional regulation. Unlike false confessions driven by pressure, Arias's statements were marked by strategic self-preservation. Psychologists often use this case to teach how personality structures influence interrogation outcomes. Not everyone breaks under pressure, and not every confession comes from fear. Then there's the case of Russell Williams, a Canadian military officer and serial offender. His interrogation is frequently praised by psychologists and law enforcement trainers alike. Investigators used meticulous evidence presentation combined with respectful tone. Instead of accusing Williams outright, they allowed him to confront the logical impossibility of his denials. Psychologists highlight a critical moment known as cognitive collapse, when a suspect realizes their internal story can no longer coexist with external facts. Williams's confession was detailed, voluntary, and consistent, hallmarks of what experts consider a psychologically sound admission. Importantly, there was no shouting, no threats, and no deception about consequences. Not all interrogations that lead to confessions are considered ethical or reliable. The case of Amanda Knox remains one of the most controversial interrogation scenarios in recent history. Knox, an American student in Italy, was interrogated for hours without a lawyer present and later recanted her statements. Psychologists analyzing the case emphasize the effects of sleep deprivation, language barriers, and social isolation. Under these conditions, the human brain becomes highly suggestible. Studies show that prolonged stress impairs memory formation, making people more likely to accept externally suggested narratives. Knox's case is now often referenced in international discussions about interrogation standards and the psychological risks of high-pressure questioning. Psychologists also pay close attention to the language used by suspects during interrogations. Research in forensic linguistics shows that truthful individuals tend to use sensory details and self-referential language, while deceptive individuals often rely on distancing phrases and passive constructions. However, experts caution against oversimplification. Stress, trauma, and personality differences can all affect speech patterns. This is why modern psychological analysis emphasizes context over isolated behaviors. Another crucial concept is interrogative suggestibility, which measures how likely someone is to change their answers based on feedback. High suggestibility doesn't mean guilt, it often means vulnerability. Children, individuals with cognitive impairments, and those with mental health conditions are especially at risk. In several documented cases, suspects confessed to crimes later proven impossible, simply because they trusted the authority of the interrogator more than their own memory. What these cases collectively show is that interrogations are as much about psychology as they are about facts. A confession is not the ultimate truth, it's a psychological event that must be evaluated carefully. Psychologists stress that reliable confessions typically include spontaneous corrections, emotional congruence, and details unknown to investigators at the time. When these elements are missing, red flags emerge. In recent years, many law enforcement agencies have begun adopting evidence-based interviewing models like the PAC method, which prioritizes information gathering over confession extraction. Psychologists support this shift, noting that it reduces false confessions while still producing accurate results. Countries that use these models report lower rates of wrongful convictions, reinforcing the idea that understanding human psychology isn't just ethical, it's effective. True crime fascinates us because it reveals the extremes of human behavior, but interrogations remind us that truth doesn't always emerge under pressure. Sometimes it emerges under understanding, and sometimes it's buried beneath fear, confusion, or the desperate need for an ordeal to end. Psychologists studying these cases aren't just analyzing criminals, they're studying the fragile mechanics of the human mind when it's pushed to its limits. If you found this deep dive into the psychology behind real-life interrogations eye-opening, make sure you're part of this community. Subscribe to the channel for more in-depth true crime analysis, hit the like button to support the work, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges what you think you know about crime, justice, and the human mind. Because the truth is rarely simple, and together, we're here to understand it.